So one of the debates that exists in the political science literature is whether and then the extent to which congressional votes matter. And there's a class of scholars who take the viewpoint that they don't matter much. And I am admittedly on the other side. So even before this election, in fact, many congressional elections ago, I had published work that suggested that, in fact, what members do, especially on high salience votes, on votes that tend to be covered in the media, matters for their electoral prospects. So one nice thing about politics is that often you get to test your theories on new elections. So today is a preliminary test, and that data is still coming in on how much candidates spent and on certain election details, but we'll get to look at how this argument holds up. So I want to start with, let's see, there we go, with two Minnesota incumbents. Some of you may know Jim Oberstar, also known as Jim Obie. You may recognize that name if you're a Congress jock. Okay, people are shaking their heads, so not as many Congress jocks. He represents the 8th District of Minnesota, a fairly conservative district. I'm also putting up Collin Peterson, who represents the 7th District of Minnesota, also actually an even slightly more conservative district. Jim Obie has served for 18 terms. He came in with the Watergate babies. He's the longest serving legislator actually in the U.S. Congress from Minnesota ever. So he is longer serving than Humphrey, longer serving than Mondale. So if I'm taking it, no one here is from Minnesota if you don't know. Oh, you are? Okay. Those who are from Minnesota would know Jim Obie. Collin Peterson has also been in a fairly long time by what we might call typical standards of holding a job, though not necessarily for Congress. So he came in 1990. They've both done very well traditionally in their elections. They both handily won in 2008. We'll see that Collin Peterson's district actually went slightly for McCain. Jim Obie's went for Obama, but by 53%, which is low nationally, and which is why it's a little bit more conservative. So both were challenged by political newcomers, and were thought by the press in the beginning to likely coast to re-election, since they had done so many times in the past. In Obie's case, he was challenged by, I have to look it up because he's such a newcomer, Chip Kravach, a retired Navy helicopter pilot who then became a stay-at-home dad. He has not served on the town council. He has not been a school board official. Unless he's hiding it from everybody, he has never served in political office. Likewise, Collin Peterson was challenged by Lee Byberg, who also had not served in political office, though was in a lot of civic organizations in his community and a high-ranking business executive, so was arguably a little bit better known in the general community. In each case, the incumbent had a substantial fundraising advantage by ratios of about 4 to 1. So what differed? So we can look. Here's their 2008 Obama vote. Here's their 2008 personal vote. And then here's their votes, legislative votes, on the stimulus, on health care, on cap and trade, and on, I also put in TARP since they were both in office. Though, of course, lots of incumbents, or some incumbents who were serving, couldn't have voted on TARP. What we see is that Peterson voted no on all of them except for cap and trade, where he took a yes vote. And Obie voted yes on all of them. And this became a central part of the campaign. The health care bill in particular was a focal point of the challenge by Kravach. There's a contested story. Kravach claims that he was inspired to run for office because he tried to get a meeting with Oberstar to discuss the health care bill with another 25 citizens, and the office said that they were unwilling to meet. Now, Oberstar denies that story and says that he would have been willing to meet, and that's just fabricated for the campaign. What is definitely true is that the political ads focused on the health care vote. They also focused on the stimulus and economic differences between the two of them. And as you can see, in 2010, Oberstar narrowly lost to this political neophyte, and Peterson coasted to re-election in a year that was, as Larry already pointed out, a fairly large wave. I don't know if it was quite a tsunami, but it was a large wave for the Republicans. So, I can find two people. That may not, that may or may not impress you. So one thing we can do is we can analyze the data from all of the House races in similar ways that I just did. We can control for a variety of factors such as Obama's 2008 vote and the members' vote in 2008, with the sense that certain members tend to be better campaigners, tend to be better liked by their district. And then we can see how various factors, including state-level unemployment, so national unemployment, of course, is the same for everybody. So we can look at that when we look over time at many elections, but not just within 2008. And we can look at how the various members voted on health care, the stimulus, and cap and trade. We can also look at TARP, but not for all of the members, because freshmen, of course, didn't vote on TARP, since that predated this congressional session. So I have to say that I was a little surprised at the magnitude of the effects. That is that the results suggest when you run these regressions that voting for health care cost Democrats 5.5 percentage points, as did a yes vote on the stimulus. And the yes vote on cap and trade a little less. Although, and I ran this after I had chosen my example, I will say, there it goes. Excuse me. Let's go. There we go. Although, if you just look at the example, it's a little bit less, but it's about the same, which is that by voting for each of those, the regression estimates would suggest that Oberstar should have received 11 percentage points less than Peterson, and he gets 10 percentage points less. And this is averaging across 230 or so races. So how does this compare to the midterm patterns since 1954? What I've done in some of my work and what others have replicated and extended is looked at how is it that various factors, including voting patterns, as well as factors like the general national economy, matter in midterm races, as well as presidential years. We tend to think those races differ a bit because, among other things, different types of voters show up, as you all know, I'm sure, in the midterm. What that research suggests is that for about every percentage point increase in national unemployment, incumbents do get about 1 percentage point less on average at the voting booth. So when you hear Democrats say the economy killed us, they're partially correct. Had unemployment been, let's say, at 5%, you would expect members to have done better. However, it's not the only factor, and you can see that, ignore all the numbers and the regressions and the statistics. You can see that just thinking back to 2006, when the economy was fairly good, and the Republicans got absolutely slaughtered in the polls. And if you think back to 1994, when the House shifted to the Republicans, the economy was fairly good. It was not that bad. And the Republicans got slaughtered, and the Democrats got slaughtered in that year. And so while the economy has an effect, it operates, and it certainly characterizes the way in which the campaigns are run. It is not the case that the economy determines the electoral results. I'm sure some of the people on the panel may disagree with me, and certainly lots of commentators and pundits disagree with that interpretation. However, if you look back over time, whether you do it through a more qualitative approach by simply talking about specific elections and when big waves have come, or whether you type in lots of data and analyze the figures that way, it is impossible to say that the economy dictates these results. They are characterized by the legislative agenda, in part, in combination with the economy, and that affects both the total returns as well as which members tend to do better and worse. So in comparison to unemployment, which has, a real effect, as I said, that would mean about 5 percentage points difference. When we look at, this year we've pulled out these 3 big votes that we know the Republicans and the Tea Party focused on when they designed their ads. Using a measure that's a little bit comparable over time are what are interest group ratings. So the Americans for Democratic Action are just one group that scales members and tries to pick out really important votes. And actually the ADA scores are often used in campaigns by challengers who will say this member voted 100% of the time with the Americans for Democratic Action, or they voted 0%. This is a Republican who isn't voting with the Democrats very much of the time. And what here we find is that about a 1 percentage point change in the members voting for shifting in 1 out of 10 of these ADA kind of major votes in an ideologically extreme direction, which means that Democrats tend to do better when they're more moderate, and the Republicans tend to do better when they're more moderate. So this is not an effect, although we're focusing on the 2010 elections today, this is not an effect that is different fundamentally than the 2006 elections, or to take another midterm where the Republicans did poorly in 1982. It's not fundamentally a partisan effect. It's a more general accountability effect that occurs. This is to be noted, this is even after accounting for spending, challenger quality, seniority, and presidential popularity. So you can try to account for all of these things, again, in either a qualitative or a more quantitative way, and these effects still remain very strongly. So what's unique about this election? I mean, I think there are some unique things. One thing that's unique is that unemployment is so extreme for the recent period. I mean, you can go back to 1982 to look at something comparable. So unemployment is very high. It is also the case that we had a Congress that was very good to Obama in the sense of being very similar in their partisan predispositions, which allowed for a lot of votes that were likely not to be as moderate as the center. And so there were more votes, you could argue, than typically, which were out of step with public opinion. You could see it back in 2006 when we had a unified Republican House and Senate with the president, and you see it today. So I'm sure you're all not going to agree with me, but those would be the two big things that I would point to as being unique about this election. So they're basically larger phenomena within the broader trends that we generally see.
Thanks, Brandice.
So I'm going to do something a little bit different. I'm not going to spend I'm going to spend a little time talking about what happened in the last election, how it relates to things that have happened in the past. But I'm going to spend most of my time thinking about the implications for the next 2 years, mostly thinking about what the policy implications are, if any, and what the implications are for the next presidential election. So let me start with a kind of a big picture macro issue. As Larry mentioned, I've done a lot of work on political polarization. I think it's a kind of an important, there's been a lot of attention paid in the media about levels of polarization and what their effects are. The evidence that I and my co-authors have amassed, as well as others, is this a very important determinant for determining how productive Congress will be in any particular time. So what I thought I would do was start with just some numbers about where we've been in terms of polarization. These are all based on, this picture here is based on estimates that my co-authors and I have done, essentially measuring the conservatism of each member of Congress using roll call votes. So we essentially measured conservatism by what percentage of your votes are in a conservative direction or with conservatives. Liberals are people who vote with liberals, conservatives are those who vote with conservatives, and we have an estimation procedure to sort out which is which. So it gives us an individual level measure of the conservatism of individual members. So this is a picture of what's been happening in the U.S. House of Representatives since the end of World War II. And you can see the polarization as the red curve is increasingly distant from the blue curve. Much of it, as has been written, begins to happen in the late 1970s. Most of it is a shift of the Republican Party to the right, but you can see that the left line, the Democratic line, has ticked down considerably as well over the past 40 years. Except, and this is a point I want to stress a little, oh, that's not what I can't figure out the pointer. Except in a point that I want to come back to. If you look at the last couple of terms, there has seemed to have been a turnaround within the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party had made important inroads in the suburbs and in otherwise Republican areas of the Northeast, or formerly Republican areas of the Northeast, as well as the South and the Mountain West. Yet the Republican continued to march ever rightward. So one of the things that had been written about and speculated about before the elections was just how much more conservative the House of Representatives would be after the election, in part just because how it would set the tenor of politics for the next 2 years, but also what effects it might have on any possibilities for policy change. So I conducted a bit of a forecast. We haven't seen the new freshman vote in Congress yet, so we can't literally estimate how conservative or liberal they would be. But I can get some leverage over looking at other members from the Republican and Democratic parties from the same region to basically forecast how they might vote, how conservative they would be. You might respond, that's not going to be good enough in this instant because we know that polarization is going to be thrust forward because of the Tea Party candidates who won in very large numbers a week ago Tuesday. But there is a Tea Party caucus currently in Congress. Michelle Bachmann got 35 of her best friends together to create a caucus. So I can get some leverage for the forecast off of how conservative Michelle Bachmann and her friends are. The bottom line is that Congress will be more polarized next year, but it's really not because of the Tea Partiers. The Republicans are going to be a little bit more conservative than they are now. That's what the big red dot is. But really, it's not off the trend. Republicans, year by year, have increased their conservatism by at least that much in many other years. So it's really not the Tea Party that's going to have a big impact. In fact, many of the Tea Party candidates won in regions of the country where Republicans really aren't that conservative. So they're going to be a little bit more conservative than the typical Republican from their region. But the Tea Party was very strong in places like Minnesota and Ohio and Pennsylvania, places where traditionally conservative Republicans haven't been all that conservative. So the Tea Party effect, I think, is not going to be a huge one. The big impact is that the Democratic push to the center of the past two elections has been completely wiped out. In part because of all the red state Democrats who were successful, many of the suburban Democrats from the Northeast who had taken more moderate positions both on economic policy issues and on social policy issues. They're the ones who took the brunt of the election. So polarized politics is with us. The Tea Party is partially to blame. But just the dynamic of a two-party system where you can't have big shifts, where we can't punish President Obama by voting out liberals, you can only punish President Obama by voting out moderates, is going to lead to more and greater polarization in the next 2 years. So that's point number one that I want to make. So the second issue I want to come to is, well, what does this portend? What does this portend for policymaking? My typical story is that polarization leads to policymaking, and I think I'll, in large degree, stick with that story. But I think that's probably not even the most important story for predicting what the next 2 years are going to be like. I think the bigger story is how polarization in the previous congressional term did not inhibit policymaking. In fact, lots of important policies were made in the last congressional term. Political scientists like to, come up with lists of important pieces of legislation as a kind of a way of measuring and gauging how successful Congress is in passing. And there are at least 3 pieces of legislation that will appear on any list going forward: the stimulus package, the health care reform bill, and the Dodd-Frank financial reform bill. And you could argue that there are some others that will make kind of the B level of these lists. So the point one I would make is, like, some really hard stuff was done already, but as hard as that stuff was, it may have been the easy stuff, say, compared to climate change legislation and other pieces of legislation we might want to talk about. And second, it come under extremely favorable circumstances for the Democratic Party to push things. In particular, they not only had very large margins, historically large margins, but the caucuses themselves were historically homogeneous and liberal by historical standards. So this is using this data we have on liberalism, conservatism of members. So what I've done for the House is I just took a couple of 2 or 3 categories of what might define a liberal based on these scores. Minus scores on this scale are liberal, plus scores are positive. So I took the percentage of the House of Representatives that meet each of these thresholds, lower than a minus 0.3, minus 0.4, minus 0.5. Those numbers themselves won't mean anything to you. But you can see that it doesn't really matter. The trends don't really matter in terms of the levels in which I cut these off don't really matter. The trends are the same. And by any of these measures, the previous House of Representatives, this is also true of the Senate, is the most liberal, homogeneous liberal in U.S. history. Now you might say, Lyndon Johnson had very big Democratic caucuses and did lots of stuff. But it's important to remember those were not homogeneous liberal ones. There were lots of conservative, moderate Democrats. You can say the same thing for Bill Clinton in 1994. But again, they were not as homogeneous as this one. But importantly, so this is a historically favorable, and these numbers go up both because the number of Democrats go up and the percentage of Democrats who are liberals go up. But notice it doesn't get to 0.5. Okay, so that's the important part of the story. So despite the fact that it's as liberal as it's ever been, the liberals are not a majority, and therefore moderates had to come along to get things passed. And the moderates were pretty concerned about this from the get-go, and many of them rebelled, meaning that the margins by which legislation was passed were really razor thin. So we know all the stories about chasing the filibuster pivotal senator, getting Scott Brown on board to have to do everything. There was, I guess it's the Mel Brooks movie, History of the World, where he says it's good to be the king. The last 2 years, it was good to be Scott Brown. Scott Brown was necessary for everything. But the House of Representatives, despite the very large Democratic majority, on many of the important pieces of legislation, the margins were something like 220 to 210. So we weren't talking big margins. And then, of course, as we know, and this just underscores the point that Brandice made, supporting the president was politically costly. So here's another way of kind of looking at Brandice's story. So here's the health care vote. Those at the top are the people who voted with the president on health care. Those on the bottom are the people who voted against the president on health care. And I plotted against the McCain vote in their district, and then whether or not they won or lost re-election. So one of the things that you can see is that among the very moderate districts, those that gave McCain, say, 45% of the vote or more, most of the people who voted with the president lost. Whereas many of the Democrats, and these are all just the Democrats, many of the Democrats who voted against the president won. Okay. So they were able to essentially save themselves by voting against the president. Just a kind of better summary of this, if you just look at the members from the districts who voted at least 40, where McCain got at least 45% of the vote. If you voted yes on the health care reform bill, you only won 63% of the time. Now that sounds like pretty good, except that historically re-election rates are north of 95%, so that's a big hit. And if you voted no, you won closer to the historical rate, 83%. In fact, the average rate of re-election was 85%. So these guys and gals did okay. The stimulus bill is a little bit harder to gauge the effect because there were not very many Democrats who voted no on stimulus, but 60% of those who did won their re-election, whereas only 60% of those who voted no won their re-election, but only 25% of those who voted yes won theirs. Okay, so the stimulus vote perhaps was more more important, but we don't really have the evidence because there were not that many who voted against it. These are all McCain greater than 45. Yeah, these are just the truncated part. Okay. So this suggests that what happened in the last 2 years, both lots of things did happen. They were very difficult to do. All the circumstances under which made them possible have essentially evaporated. So we're not only left with polarization in a smaller Democratic caucus, but we're left with the bills that were so hard that they couldn't even be done under these more favorable circumstances. So where does that leave us in terms of implications? Well, I mean, I think gridlock obviously is going to be an important one. A little bit concerning because we're still in a very volatile economic environment, one in which Ireland could go bankrupt, roiling financial markets, and California could go bankrupt, roiling financial markets, and there will need to be some governmental response. And the fact that that voting yes on the stimulus package and voting yes on TARP back in 2008, or even voting on TARP 2 in 2009 was so politically costly, it's going to be very difficult, in particular, to deal with financial crises. There will be a change in the style of politics. I think there will be a move away from an aggressive legislative agenda to more of what I call blame game politics, where the sides are basically taking the next 2 years to define positions for the next election. So we should see lots of vetoes, lots of investigations, all of those things. One advantage the Obama administration does have is that one of the things that's true about gridlock and polarization is it makes it easier for the president to move into administrative mode. Now it's time to start implementing regulations. Fortunately, he got 2 very big, important pieces of legislation that now have to be implemented. And at least he can console himself that the Republicans can do little beyond hold hearings in order to interfere with that. Through a great degree of foresight in the financial reform bill, the budget of the new Consumer Financial Protection Agency is protected because it comes directly from the Fed rather than from Congress. And that was a brilliant piece of foresight because that's the type of luck that they're going to need for the next 2 years. So let me just turn very briefly to what this portends for Obama's reelection. One of the striking things is that if you look at the rate of a president's party loss at the midterm and his rate of success in getting reelected, the correlation is as close to 0 as it can possibly be. I was at an all-day conference at the University of Georgia on the midterm elections. I don't know how many people put that picture up on a slide, so I spared you by putting it up, but it is as close to 0 as it can be. There are plenty of presidents who've lost big at the midterms and have been successful. But I think it does suggest that if the statistical data don't give us the answer, we should look at kind of models, presidents who have kind of gone through this and what they did to be successful. And 2 of the successful ones come to mind, so it's worth kind of considering, and maybe I'll just throw the ideas out there. Maybe we can come back to them and question the answers. So there's the Truman model, which was to essentially let Congress do its thing, or in particular, let Congress not do its thing, and then run against the do-nothing Congress 2 years later and be successful. Of course, that worked for Truman because Congress was completely in Republican hands, and all the blame for not doing anything could be squarely shifted to Congress. There's the Clinton model, which has really 2 parts, and we can argue about which part's more important. First part is find some center, find something you can do with the other party. Find something you can do to restore the confidence of your own moderates in your administration. Give them something that they can vote with you on. So for Clinton, it was NAFTA and welfare reform to a certain extent were the kind of bipartisan issues. Now the difficulty for Obama there is it's not clear to me what those issues might be this time. It could be possibly education reform. It was about 15 minutes when I thought it might be some form of kind of entitlement reform, but given the response to the initial proposals by the Debt Commission, that seems to be implausible. The other thing to remember is if we were to go back to the pictures I showed you, the world looked very different in 1993 and 94 when Clinton had to do this. Politics is just much more polarized now. The other thing that Clinton did was hold the line against Republican excesses when they tried to shut down the government. So in a sense, what Obama needs is for the Republicans to try to do that again. That's a dance that he can't do by himself. So the big question will be, will the Republicans be suckered into that trap? They say they won't be, but you know, sometimes, especially when you have 45 new members who identify with, you know, the Tea Party, it may be hard not to kind of walk in to these situations. But you know, so anyway, those are two possible models. I'm a little skeptical that either of those models gives Obama the way. There might be another model. There might be the Obama model. So I'm not saying he won't get reelected, but the history is not a very good guide as to what he should do. Thanks.
Steve Rogers.
Hi, my name is Steve Rogers, and I'm a Ph.D. candidate here at Princeton. And I'm looking forward to talking to you today a little bit about what happened in our state legislative elections a couple weeks ago. And so the question that was posed to this panel was whether or not the 2010 elections was a mid-course correction. However, when I'm thinking about state legislatures, I don't necessarily think it's a mid-course correction as much as it is a decades correction. And so the story I'm going to try to tell you is that, at least in the non-South, what happened on Election Day is the Republicans wiped out a decade's worth of Democratic gains. And then in the South, what we saw is pretty much Republicans continuing some trends that have been going on. Oh, it's going automatically. Sorry. I don't know what that is. They're continuing on from, like, this has been going on for decades. And so what happened last week, or a couple weeks ago? The Republicans won big. There were over 6,000 state legislative elections, and Republicans picked up over 680 seats. They now hold more state legislative seats than they have since before the days of FDR. And in these successes, they were able to flip 19 state legislative chambers. This is the biggest swing that we've seen since Watergate. And some of these chambers they have not held for a very, very long time. And so in Alabama and North Carolina, they picked up the state legislatures, and this is the first time they've done it since the days of Lincoln. It's always good when you can reference an election and your time in history is the Civil War. I apologize that I don't know why it's automatically going. Sorry about that. And so this is what happened pretty much on Election Day. The Republicans now have control of a majority of state legislative chambers. Red states up here signify where Republicans have unified control, and blue states signify where Democrats have unified control. Purple states are where there's split control over the chambers or there's a tie. And the contrast that I want to draw for you is not necessarily to the 2008 elections quite yet, but what I want to show you is say, let's compare it to the last time we had redistricting. And so let's compare it to 2002. And so this is the maps of 2002 in the non-South and the South. And they may seem a little different. And just to highlight these differences, I put some states in yellow. So these yellow states signify where there's at least one legislative chamber that a different party controls. Now the thing is, at first this difference may seem kind of large, but it's not. There's only 22 seats difference. And so if you let me change 22 seats of over 5,500 non-Southern state legislative seats, I can give you identical chamber control maps. And so what this is showing is that we're actually not that far away from where we were about a decade ago. And so the two maps are identical. And so this is why I'm saying it may be more of a decades correction and not necessarily this mid-course correction responding just to the Obama administration. And so, but we are in a different spot than we were 2 years ago. There's a lot more blue on the 2008 map than in the 2010 map. But the point I want to express is Democrats didn't just win in 2008. They didn't just win in 2006. Democrats won in 2003, 2004, 2005, 6, 7, and 8. And so what Republicans did on Election Day is wipe out almost a decade's worth of gains by Democrats. And so this is a decades correction, not just a mid-course correction. Now, I've only talked about the non-South so far, and there are these states I've grayed out down South. So what about them? What about the South? And so Republicans are doing quite well for themselves down there as well. They control over 3/4 of state legislative chambers and control a majority of state legislative seats for the first time ever. But this wasn't the story just a couple decades ago. Democrats had unified control over the southern state legislatures. And this is the story that was for most of the 20th century. And so, this is going for me automatically still, but it's going timed well. I apologize for that. So if you look since, say, the World War II, Democrats controlled pretty much all state legislative chambers in the South. But it wasn't until 2 decades ago that the Republicans started chipping away at the Democrats' holdings down South. And this is a slow continuing trend over 2 decades. This didn't just happen on November 3rd. What happened on November 3rd was this continuing decades trend, or this decades correction that we're seeing in the South. And so the argument that I've made to you so far is what we saw on November 3rd is not necessarily a mid-course correction, but it's this decades correction. In the non-South, we see like the Democratic gains that were earned over the last decade wiped away. And meanwhile, in the South, we're seeing this continuing trend that went over decades. And so I think that's a better way to think about this election. It's continuing stuff that's been happening over decades. Now, why did this happen? Due to time restrictions, I can't get into everything. But if you have any questions regarding, say, Citizens United or party voting, I encourage you to bring them up in Q&A. But one thing I want to bring your attention to is maybe state legislators got caught up in this wave a bit. So this is a graph that was made by John Coleman at the University of Wisconsin. And what it shows is the number of seats lost in the state houses and a U.S. House by members of the president's party. And as you can see in this graph, their electoral fates seem to be pretty well tied. And this is interesting when you think about accountability and some of the things that we've heard earlier on this panel. We've heard that votes matter, for example. But my state legislator didn't vote on the health care reform bill. And my state legislator didn't vote on the stimulus package. So this raises interesting questions about how voters are holding their state legislators accountable because they're sharing a similar fate to their federal legislators. And so I just thought I'd bring that up. I find this graph very interesting, and it's some food for thought. Now, the last thing that I want to talk about is the implications of, say, these state legislative elections on future elections. And so one of the big things in this election is its impact on redistricting. And with Republicans doing quite well, they're in a much better position than they were a couple of years ago. And so Democrats, they were able to redistrict in 2008. They would have been able to redraw over 100 districts. They had complete control over the lines over well over 100 districts. But after the 2010 elections, Republicans get to control the lines of almost 200 districts. Now, this could have significant implications for the elections that we have over the next decade. But it's not only Republicans get to redraw some of the lines, they get to draw some new lines themselves. And so with the reapportionment and the census figures, some states are going to lose some congressional seats, and some states are going to gain some congressional seats. So Ohio is losing 2, but Texas is gaining 4. And we may remember that in the early 2000s, the Tom DeLay redistricting, where the Republicans were able to, say, create a few more districts for themselves and give them a greater advantage in the U.S. House. But now the census has given Republicans 4 more seats in Texas to play with. And Texas has Republicans across the board in the state legislature. So they may be able to draw some more districts for themselves by being given new seats. But also, they get to redraw some of the old seats, too, in places that they may never have had an opportunity to before, like North Carolina. So North Carolina, if you're a Democrat, it's a beautifully gerrymandered state. It's absolutely beautiful. But Republicans now, for the first time ever, control the state legislature down there. And so by controlling the state legislature, when I talked to some North Carolina Democrats last week, they said, we're afraid of losing maybe 3 to 4 seats just through redistricting because we had some creative gerrymandering before, and Republicans can balance it out this time through. And Republicans, there's also some other good news for Republicans due to the election outcome in 2010. California passed redistricting reforms, and they're moving more towards a commission-based system. California was another beautifully gerrymandered map for Democrats. But now by moving to a commission, it may have to become a little more neutral, and Republicans may have some more opportunities. And when we can go back and compare it to, say, the 2000 redistricting, Republicans are in better shape again because they now have veto players in 8 new states. And so what I mean by a veto player is, say Democrats had unified control over a state government, and Republicans this election took the state Senate. So by taking the state Senate, they can force Democrats to compromise with them a little bit. Say, hey, if you want a redistricting plan to get through, you need our approval. So this could help them out some. And so they may be able to moderate some of their Democratic gerrymanders. But it's important to consider it's not just necessarily about these veto players. There could be veto players like the courts that come involved, or even informal players coming in like U.S. House members trying to protect their own district and applying informal political pressure. So we're in for some interesting political stories over the next few months as people cut deals over redistricting. Now, while there was a lot of good news for Republicans, there's a little good news for Democrats. In Florida, there was also a redistricting referendum, but it wasn't as strong as the one in California, unfortunately. I'm a Democrat, I'm sorry. You heard my resume. And also, Republicans may have too many freshmen to protect. And so what we saw in Pennsylvania, for example, is they created some more marginal districts to gain a few, but those swung back and forth over the past elections. And so this time around with these vulnerable Republicans, they may try to shore up their support instead of creating these new districts necessarily, and in a backwards way that could be advantageous to Democrats. And Democrats themselves also gained veto players in 4 states as compared to where they were in 2000. And so the state legislative elections, there was a huge swing and may have huge implications. But I don't necessarily think that it was a mid-course correction necessarily. At least in the non-South, it seemed to correct or send us back to where we were about a decade ago. And in the South, it's tended to continue this decades-long trend of pretty much the decline of the Southern Democrat. And so with these decades corrections that we saw in the 2010 elections, it may have implications for our elections over the next decade. And so we'll just see how all this plays out. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. Last but surely not least, David Welna.
Hi, greetings from Capitol Hill, where I'm playing hooky today. As many of you know, today is the first day of the lame duck session of the 111th Congress. Can you hear me?
No.
I'll try to project more. We have the last gasp of the 111th Congress already underway. We just had 2 Democratic senators sworn in the Senate chamber this afternoon. The big question is, what is the end of this Congress going to do after this phenomenal event that we had 2 weeks ago today? Is this going to be a Congress that takes care of the urgent unfinished business that it sort of punted for after the election? Or are Democrats going to have so little fight left in them, despite the fact that they control both chambers still, that they will just punt it once more into the 112th Congress, and we'll have, of course, Republicans controlling the House and Democrats still in charge of the Senate, however with a majority that's 6 members smaller. Now, looking at what's going on right now, I think the question of was this a mid-course correction that we had 2 weeks ago? I look at it more as kind of a combination of a purification on the one hand, and that is that if you were the kind of lawmaker who looked to make deals across the aisle or voted across the aisle, the kind of thing that everyone is saying Congress should do, let's cooperate, let's work together and so on, that's a career ender. I mean, that's what happened to people like Ike Skelton. Arlen Specter thought he could finesse this by switching parties. He didn't even win his primary. Blanche Lincoln got voted out. Russ Feingold, who would cross the aisle and work with people like John McCain, got voted out. The message of this election, I think, was purity. Don't make compromise. Stick with the center of your party or the extreme of your party, and you're in much safer territory than if you're in the middle. So I think we do have a much more polarized Congress that we have coming up. I think that even this lame duck session may show how the idea of working together may be a very noble one that the voters are asking for, but in practicality, it doesn't work out. If you look at what happened to the Blue Dogs, for example, in the House, there were 58 Blue Dogs. These are centrist Democrats who often agree with Republicans on fiscal policy. They're all for tax cuts. They're all for the kind of deficit reduction that Republicans have been calling for, 30 of those 58 blue dogs lost their jobs in the election. As a consequence, of course, you are going to have a House Democratic caucus that is much more liberal overall than it's been for the last Congress. What that means in terms of what Democrats are going to do in the House, maybe not that much, because historically the minority party in the House hasn't been able to do much just because of the rules of the House. The Senate's a whole different issue. If you look at the Senate has historically been the graveyard of legislation sent out by the House. You look at something like the cap and trade bill, which proved so costly to people like Jim Oberstar. The Senate didn't even hold a vote on that. And so House Democrats kind of learned their lesson. You let the Senate go first on controversial legislation before sticking your neck out and voting on it. So I think we're going to see an interesting dynamic going on over the whole question of the expiration of the Bush-era tax cuts, which happens at the end of this year. This is a big issue that it is very much in the interest of Republicans to resolve in this Congress. They have to work with Democrats somehow on this. Democrats actually have kind of an upper hand in this, in that they're the ones who bring legislation out to the floor. And in the Senate, if they bring out a bill that says, for example, and it is in line with President Obama, we will extend tax cuts for income levels up to $250,000, but not beyond that. What do Republicans do? If they filibuster it, they run the risk of all the tax cuts expiring at the end of the year, and they're blamed as the party that raised people's taxes effectively. That's a risk that they run. Democrats might run the risk of people just looking at Congress and saying, Congress let the tax cuts expire. It's a game of chicken that's going to be going on. But Democrats are under tremendous pressure from the left to take a hard line on this and say, we will extend the lower tax cuts and not the upper ones. You're getting some signs of that some Democrats are saying, wait a minute, we can't be that drastic. Chuck Schumer from New York is saying, let's make the cutoff be income above $1 million will not get an extension of the tax cuts. You're getting Mark Warner from Virginia saying, let's not extend the tax cuts for the upper two levels. Let's use that money instead as tax breaks for small business. And we may get some buy-in from enough Republicans to get past the filibuster to do that. Those things are going to be playing out. Then this is all going to go over to the House once the Senate deals with it. But I think that you're going to see Republicans be a bit more cooperative with Democrats in the lame duck session when it comes to these tax cuts, because it's not just the income tax cuts that are expiring. The estate tax, which went away entirely this year, will come back in the form that it was when the Bush tax cuts took effect, which was basically that $1 million can be passed on to heirs without being taxed. The rest of it would be taxed at up to 55%. That's the prospect of that happening focuses the mind, I think, of a lot of Republicans. It gives them an incentive to find some grand bargain with Democrats, along with the fact that the capital gains tax cut that was passed in 2003, reducing the capital gains tax cut from 20 to 15%, or tax rate from 20 to 15%, and also the dividends tax cut that dividends were taxed as basically as personal income. So if you were a high income earner, your tax rate on dividends could conceivably go up to more than 39% on January 1st. This is a big incentive for Republicans to work with Democrats. I think that you're going to see other areas such as the New START treaty, this is arms reduction treaty that Obama has been unable to move through the Senate. It requires 2/3 approval in the Senate. Republicans, I can't see sticking their necks out on this one. There's a lot of skepticism about, well, this would be a win for Obama. We already have the Republican leader in the Senate saying the top priority for the next 2 years is making sure that Obama is a one-term president. Mitch McConnell shows his hand that way, and everything he does is then seen in light of what his top priority is. It was sort of a declaration of bad faith, something you didn't hear that much from John Boehner. But I think that what it promises is that the next 2 years in Congress are going to hold a lot of strife. And you're going to see constant efforts from Republicans to hack away at the Obama health care law, efforts to repeal it in the House. In the Senate, there may be efforts to defund parts of that bill, deny the IRS money so that it can enforce the part of the law that will go into effect in 2014, saying that everybody has to have health insurance. You're not going to see, I think, any kind of repeal coming out of Congress because, of course, Senate Democrats could filibuster anything that came up on the Senate floor. The fact is, in the Senate, the old dynamic was that Mitch McConnell was the chief gravedigger for legislation sent over from the House. They could filibuster anything from cap and trade to the food safety bill, which Democrats are going to try again on Wednesday to bring up. Harry Reid is going to be the new gravedigger in chief because he's the majority leader. He's the first person recognized on the floor. He can bring up legislation when he wants to or not bring it up. And it's pretty hard for Republicans to force him to bring up legislation. So Mitch McConnell will have reasons to make nice with Harry Reid if he wants his friend John Boehner's bills to get any consideration at all in the Senate. So if you look at that kind of a dynamic, it may not be quite as fractious as it would seem from McConnell's rhetoric that his job is really to make sure that Obama is a one-termer. But I think that overall in Congress, because you have a more polarized bunch of lawmakers who've learned the lesson that working together can lead to the end of your career in Congress, that we'll see lots of sort of message votes on things in the House from the Republicans, in the Senate from the Democrats. The Democrats, I think, are going to be playing offense in the lame duck. They're going to be trying to use these great big majorities that they still have in the lame duck to push through everything they can. And then they're going to switch to playing defense in January, trying to defend what they accomplished in the first 2 years of Congress. And I think that looking back on what happened with this election, I think that Democrats are kind of recognizing belatedly that while they accomplished a lot in this last Congress, and given the kind of resistance that they ran into, it took these almost historical or historic majorities that they had to get the health care bill through, for example. They were seen as muscling things through against the will of the American people. That was the narrative that Republicans put forth, and it was the message that actually won the day, I think, in the election. As virtuous as what Democrats might have done, they failed to sell what they were doing to the American public. And they were punished at the polls for it, which is partly why 2 years from now, if Obama is reelected, it may be also because this vote was largely a punishment vote. It was not an embrace of Republican principles. In fact, polls showed that Republicans are still held in lower esteem than Democrats are across the country, even after the election. If Republicans show that all they're doing is sabotaging the effort to try to restore the economy, I think that they're going to find that 2 years from now that the pendulum is swinging back again. So they have the incentive to show that they're doing something. And I think spending all their time trying to repeal the healthcare law, when everyone knows it's probably a futile exercise anyhow, is a very risky proposition. So, I mean, that's as much of a crystal ball as I'll venture into. But I think that you're going to see this strange dynamic of lawmakers saying, I won't compromise, and at the same time realizing that in their interest and in their party's interest, 2 years from now, those who can show that they've done something in Congress are probably the ones who people are going to want to reelect.
Thanks, Dave. So if I put all these comments together, it sounds like we have a public that is tired of polarization and desperate for solutions to problems and wants to reward people for compromising, which proceeded to vote out the people who were most likely to compromise, increase the level of polarization, and rewarded the party that refused to cooperate in any policy response to the crisis. So is this a problem with the voters? Is it a problem with the system? Sounds like something's wrong.
I would disagree a little bit with the statement of those two. I mean, it depends on how you define compromise. So, I mean, it's a midterm election. Traditionally, the president's party doesn't do as well in the midterm, and we're defining compromise as Republicans supporting Democrats. If I were putting on a John Boehner hat here, I mean, he would say that Democrats who compromise with the Republicans and held different positions than their party did that. So, I mean, it partly compromise can be the eye of the beholder. The Republicans didn't have agenda setting power, so you can't, you know. If we were discussing 2006 in a purely nonpartisan way, I mean, we wouldn't say, I wouldn't say, well, the problem is that the Republicans, you know, it was all the Democrats were non-compromising. I think a partisan Republican would say that. Right? That is what John Boehner would say. The Democrats were the party of no.
I think another thing is, too, that about half of the House Democrats who lost their seats in this election were Blue Dogs. Now, the Blue Dogs are the ones who are much more likely to vote against their party, vote with Republicans on things. But the fact is also that they represented districts that were more conservative. And so, you know, that was a survival technique for them, too. And the fact that they got voted out, it's not quite the same to be voted out of Ike Skelton's district, for example, which went from McCain, 65% voted for McCain 2 years ago, compared to Nancy Pelosi's district. You know, she's very safe where she is. So, I mean, I think part of it, too, was that Democrats picked up so many seats in conservative districts 2 years ago that they were highly vulnerable this time in the midterm.
Right, no, and this is the same with the Northeast Republicans. So, you know, so you see this, they lose, and then it's just they're the more moderate ones, but they're the ones who are representing these much more liberal districts. And so in some ways, they have, if they're not, you know, if they're not liberal enough, and they kind of go with their party a lot, they are going to be punished.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just an unfortunate aspect of the system that whether it's through gerrymandering, which I don't think is as big a deal as some people think, or it's just that there are regional differences. It's just the fact that many House members are safe, and those that are safe tend to represent liberal districts or conservative districts, and you have almost like a World War I trench warfare where you're moving the line, you know, 3 or 4 miles each direction in Flanders over the past decade, and the ground that was captured over the past 4 years was the ground that was ceded here. Where I think it's not kind of indiscriminate is that, you know, based on the data that Brandice presented and I presented, voters did kind of hone in on exactly those members who kind of voted out of step with their districts. They didn't indiscriminately for moderate Democrats. They just didn't moderate Democrats that voted in ways that they didn't approve of. And so her 5.5% disadvantage for voting for the health care bill is inconsequential if you're going to get 75% of the vote. But if you're in a district where you can get 52% of the vote at the best of times, that's going to throw you out.
Other questions? Yes, and Beth.
Yes. Actually, I disagree with most of first of all, historically, since I think somebody mentioned Lincoln, anyway, we'll go back to Lincoln. Historically, the president, whatever party is in power with the president, it almost always switches during midterm elections. There's only 4 times in the history of our country that it hasn't switched. Theodore Roosevelt, which he was the most popular president during first term anyway. FDR, because of depression. Bush, because of 9/11, and Clinton, because of, I think, all the missteps the Republicans made with, his impeachment. So it always switches. So I don't know why there's such a big deal about
I think we all agree about those facts.
But
the
here's
point
my
I
question.
made was simply that losing in the midterm doesn't mean you're not going to get reelected president. That's the point. That's the point I wanted to stress. I mean, presidents always lose seats. Now, 60 is really a big number. Okay, I mean, it's hard to console yourself with saying that presidents always lose because they almost always lose half that number. So, yeah, closer to 30. So.
But I guess I'm saying that's what I'm saying too. I don't think that, and actually I'm a Republican. I would say that. I don't think that means that President Obama is going to be a one-term president. Just looking at it historically. But my question is actually, do you all feel that because this has happened, do you think that President Obama will resort to more leaning toward executive orders to get some things done because of the situation? Because to me, he did not sound like he was somebody that was ready to necessarily work with the other side. Do you think he'll resort to executive orders to get things done the way he wants to get them done?
He's already been doing it, in fact. I mean, his decision to appoint the new head of Medicare and Medicaid, rather than going through the Senate confirmation process, and Elizabeth Warren to the Consumer Protection Bureau also, I mean, he just decided that there was no percentage in going through all of the drama of Senate confirmation and probably not getting it in the end. We see the Fed doing this quantitative easing as an alternative to legislative action to get the economy going. With the financial regulatory bill, there are going to be lots of things that the executive branch can do for the implementation of that. I mean, I just think that we're going to see kind of a much more assertive executive branch in the next few years than what we've had in the last 2.
I mean, just the irony of this is that one of the criticisms that was levied in the previous administration was how heavy-handed the executive branch was. I think there's a reason under the circumstances the executive branches get kind of heavy-handed, and I think Obama is going to have to use all of those levers, and I don't see any reason why he won't try to do that. I had this 15 seconds. I had this 15 seconds of hope that this would be a grounds for some type of compromise. If you think about, even from the Democrats' perspective, now that they can think about doing things with Social Security because there's no threat of personal accounts or partial privatization, or any of the stuff that scared them off Social Security reform before the Republicans had it. So maybe they could have taken a big step there. But given that no sooner than and it wasn't the report of the commission as a whole, it was just kind of a report of the 2 leaders, Simpson and Erskine Bowles. The fact that both sides just said these are silly ideas, they're non-starters, suggests to me that nothing's going to happen, even if. So there's no chance that the full commission, or 14 out of 18 or whatever is required, will agree to them. Therefore, Congress can't be forced to vote on them. Congress will not vote on them on their own accord. So I don't think there's going to be anything that happens there.
I tend to agree with Alan Greenspan, who says that until this country faces another gigantic crisis similar to the great panic of the fall of '08, Congress is not going to be moved to take drastic action, which is really what this commission is looking for. That could be a serious fall in ratings of Treasury bills, for example. If you have a huge bond crisis like that, suddenly it would focus people's attention on that something has to be done. If they don't do something, the alternative might be disaster. But looking at how Congress is these days, I think it would take a kind of a brinksmanship situation like that, rather than a considered discussion and debate about how much spending cuts should we have versus increased taxes. I think that kind of a rational discussion at this point is out of the question.
Because you don't have green spend to help generate the price.
No, I agree. I mean, I think though that the one thing that could generate it in the near term would be California approaching more default. Yeah, because that will scare investors for the federal government as well. If it came to be.
Yes.
Thank you. First of all, this has been really interesting. So my question is relating to the Democratic strategy moving forward. I think there's pretty much consensus that the party has lost independent votes, and there needs to be some sort of move to the middle, both to get the president elected in 2012 again, but also to pick up some of the seats that probably will eventually revert back to Democrats. That fell because of the wave election. I'm wondering where the dissatisfaction, I guess discontent among the progressive contingent of the Democratic Party factors in. I think in some way, so I guess the question is, do they matter in 2012? Can the president move to the middle and afford to kind of forget his Democratic base and still be elected? And is there any way to thread that needle? Because it seems like it's kind of impossible to energize the base that got elected in the first place and still play to the middle. That sounds like a very talented politician. I'm not sure if that's true.
So the third prong of the Clinton strategy that I forgot to mention was to have the Republicans nominate Bob Dole. So the other thing that could help is that there could be a Republican nominee that will help.
Who turned 85 today, by the way?
What?
Who turned 85 today?
So the Republican could nominate a weak candidate, which would allow him to do this, and the progressives aren't going to sit home and let Sarah Palin become the president. So that's one part. The second part is, although I'm a moderate, and I like the idea that people should move to the middle and do things in the middle. I think it's important to recognize that independent voters aren't necessarily moderate. Some of them are moderate. Some of them want moderate policy. I think a better way to describe them is they're kind of performance-oriented. So the other way to thread the needle is to succeed at something, improve the economy, have unemployment rate go down. And if he does that with like left-wing policies or progressive policies, then he'll get reelected. Where I think he'd run into problems is if performance lags, so that he's not going to get the performance-oriented independent voters, and he moves to the left, and therefore alienates the moderate-oriented independent.
I also wanted to start with a thanks. This was really interesting presentation. Specifically for Professor Canes-Wrone, I wonder when you said that you, in both the analysis of the recent election and past midterms, you controlled for political spending. To what extent did you include, especially in this recent cycle, the unregulated spending that's gone on post-Citizens United?
Yeah, so for 2010, I don't have all the spending yet. We just
So
won't have all of it.
Okay.
We can get some estimates, and so for example, in the paired example, the estimates are a little bit better, but we're still waiting for the FEC reports to come in, and then yes, getting the data. I think it will be more important now, though it was never totally unimportant, but it will be more important now to get the independence, because actually the official Republican expenditure this time around, you can see in the official races, we're often overwhelmed by the.
Okay, so in 2010, you didn't include the independent expenditures, but in the past midterm cycles you did?
Yeah, so I have done some work that does, but not, the estimates I presented, they are in the FEC reports. And so,
That don't necessarily include Republican aligned groups.
well, or
that are outside the
Democratic
party.
aligned groups, I mean, they also
Right.
don't include Democratic, right.
Sorry,
So
party
that's-
aligned groups.
Yeah, no. They don't include independent acts, but I'll just say one word, or two words, Meg Whitman, I mean, to kind of highlight that, well, I mean, a large body of evidence suggests that spending matters, but just not as much as is commonly portrayed. Now, that is pre-Citizens United, so I don't want to say that means we don't matter now, but that we see candidate after candidate who just spend enormous amounts of their own money and are plausible candidates. I mean, I do not. I mean, she's a Princetonian who's given a lot of money to Princeton, so to be particularly polite. But I think even outside of that, I think she was a very plausible candidate, and many people early on thought she would win. I mean, it was not, and she spent enormous amounts of money, and the money, money has to be connected to, to voter preferences.
Well, although the places where those tremendous personal fortunes were spent were places that greatly favored Democrats already, and they were trying to sort of overcome that difference with their wealth. I'd say overall, a very significant factor in this election was that Democrats were far outspent by Republicans in many key races, and generally the candidate who spent more ended up winning the election too. I mean, the numbers aren't in to
Right, I was just
quantify
gonna
that
say,
yet.
you wanna,
Yes, but anecdotally, I mean, looking at individual races, I've noticed that Harry Reid actually had about as much money as Sharon Engel did in Nevada, and he pulled it off. But that was not the case in Arkansas, where Blanche Lincoln was far outspent by Roosevelt.
Well, and particularly with the Overstar example, I wonder if the importance of his vote record is a little overstated there, given that, I don't know the numbers. But
That is a race for, I mean, at least the current, again, I don't want to say too much because, data's still coming in, but the press accounts are that he spent 4 to 1. Sorry, that Opie spent 4 to 1. So there was
and you
just,
think that includes the spending from Republican aligned groups?
I mean, he clearly had a big spending advantage. The Republican aligned groups did not come in with that. I mean, and Minnesota's not that expensive a television. So this isn't one we needed. So you could, I mean, that works both ways in that the Republican groups don't have to spend that much to get on TV, but then they're also not spending that.
Right.
We're working down this road, so the rest of you get your question ready.
Do you think there is going to be any progress with carbon regulation anytime soon? If so, how might that happen?
I've actually followed that issue, and I don't think you're going to see anything like the cap and trade legislation that the House had. I think what you're going to see are efforts by Republicans to put restrictions on the EPA, and they'd be joined by people like Jay Rockefeller in the Senate, who wants a 2-year moratorium on the EPA's ability, which has been upheld by the Supreme Court, to regulate carbon emissions. It's going to be more action against any efforts to limit global warming than efforts in favor of it. You may get some sort of small bore bills favoring manufacture of electric vehicles. I think the Volt is supposed to be built in Tennessee, so right there you have 2 Republican votes in favor of it. But bigger policy initiatives that address carbon emissions, I can't see it in the next few years.
Was there some version of a significant bill that might have passed in the last year and a half?
There was, for a while, Lindsey Graham was backing such legislation. John McCain at that point was getting a very stiff challenge from the right in his primary, and it was kind of making McCain look bad, the fact that Lindsey Graham was out there on that, and also on immigration. And all of a sudden, from one week to the next, Lindsey Graham pulled back from both of them and said, "I'm not going to do this anymore." And that was the last hope for doing anything in a bipartisan way.
Yes, sir.
more money was spent in this election. It's documented. Yet the overall vote went down, which meant the cost per vote went up, I guess. Isn't it more important to turn out the voters? And money may not be that critical?
I would say Nevada, which I was out covering right up to the election, was a great example of where, you know, you can go out and you can poll people, and you'll find likely voters and so on, and have all these polls that look like, okay, these are the people who are really going to vote. You can't depend on those, and that's why Harry Reid won by 5 percentage points. Nobody foresaw that in the polls, and it was because they had this tremendous on-the-ground get-out-the-vote operation where they were yanking people out of their houses, pulling people out of casinos, putting them on buses, and taking them.
Well, maybe that's what has to be done.
And that's the kind of thing that doesn't show up in polling. But I think that the money Reid was spending, he wasn't spending as much on TV ads as Sharon Angle was. He was spending it on getting those bodies into the polling booths.
Right, as I was gonna say, the buses and the,
Yeah.
and the campaign workers, yeah, this.
But turnout in midterm elections is always low. It always dips below what it was in the presidential election. So I wouldn't read too much into the turnout being lower than it was 2 years ago. I think overall, it's been rising a little bit over the past decade, both in presidential and midterms, comparing apples and apples. So I wouldn't be too pessimistic that the money didn't translate into more vote.
But it does urge some caution in terms of talking about the voters and what they wanted in 2008 and what they now want in 2010, since the total number of Republican votes cast in 2010 was way lower than 2008, which is the Democratic vote declined more. Yes.
There's been some palace intrigue about how there might be a conflict brewing between John Boehner, and the Young Guns coalition of Hensarling and Cantor and Paul Ryan. I was wondering if you particularly, Mr. Roman, could comment on whether that might increase the likelihood that the Republicans overplay their hand like they did.
Yeah, I think John Boehner's strategy is to keep his friends and his enemies close to him. And so, you know, we saw this challenge in the leadership race among House Republicans from Michelle Bachmann, who was gunning for the number 4 position, and Jeb Hensarling was sort of anointed by Boehner and his crowd as the person who should get that job, and she finally backed down. That tells you, for one thing, that Boehner is not that worried about a Tea Party backlash. The numbers just aren't that great in this caucus of Tea Party-backed lawmakers. The other thing is that Hensarling comes from the Republican Study Committee, and that is the most conservative Republicans in the House. And by pulling him into the leadership, in some ways, Boehner may keep him more in his fold. And I mean, I think the fact that very publicly Michelle Bachmann was rebuffed and Hensarling favored instead tells you how concerned Boehner is about keeping people like these young guns sort of within the fold, because Boehner really is sort of this establishment sort of almost old style politician, and he's older and he's his habits are different from the younger ones. He's a bit precarious, and I think Mitch McConnell is kind of the same way in the Senate too. It's kind of a different crowd there, but Jim DeMint is the one who's really threatening him. Today there was a very interesting development in the Senate. Senate Republicans are meeting tomorrow to vote privately, both on leadership, but also on some big policy questions. One of them is about whether there should be a moratorium on earmarks in the next Congress. And this is something that Boehner is behind in the House, and that there was not much debate in the House about whether the Republicans would do it. In the Senate, though, McConnell is an appropriator. Jim Inhofe too, and McConnell last week at the Heritage Foundation said, I don't think that's a good idea. Earmarks are not that big part of the budget, and it's our discretion that's important. Today he went out on the Senate floor and he said, I get it. I can't criticize Democrats for ignoring the voters. If I do the same, I am going to endorse the ban on earmarks. That was actually, I think, kind of a sign that he didn't want to be put to a test, McConnell or DeMint. But it shows that there is a kind of an insurgency going on that the leaders are trying to deal with.
Does anybody want to venture a view about the future of the Tea Party more generally outside of the Congressional caucus? Will we still meet in mid-November of 2012 talking about the Tea Party?
I think you'll be talking about tea parties. It's not a very coherent movement. So for every, I'm sorry, we'll be talking about multiple tea parties perhaps. It's not a very coherent movement, either organizationally or ideologically. I mean, you have these libertarians like Rand Paul, and then more social conservatives. Social conservatives, the issues didn't get a lot of play because they weren't very salient electorally, but I think that just suggests that many of the Tea Party candidates are good politicians and they knew which issues played and which ones didn't. But I think below that surface, there's not a lot of coherence in that movement. If you look at voters who support or sympathetic to the Tea Party, they look no different than other Republican voters in terms of the issues that positions they take. They're a little bit more conservative than others, but they're not different in any particular way. And I think just the multiple organizations, there'll be a lot of infighting about who represents the Tea Party, who speaks for the Tea Party, and I suspect that will sort itself out, and these people will integrate themselves well into the mainstream Republican Party, which is a very conservative party. It's not that they're going to be less conservative, but they're going to be less likely to distinguish themselves from the core of the Republican Party.
2 words, Sarah Palin. I think that will determine how much Tea Party will be a factor in the next election. If she's the Republican nominee, they definitely would be given a prominent role, I think, in the campaign. If she's not.
I want to just say thank you for the questions. The provost of the university demanded that I be at a meeting at 6. So this has been interesting. I have to literally run. Thank you.
The rest of us, I think, have time for one more. If anybody has one more question. Yes, ma'am.
Do you think the results of this election will have an effect on whether Obama will take a stronger stand for legislation or for the Congress, or is he going to continue his sort of demeanor?
I mean, I think that he'll probably appear to take a stronger stand because he will be criticizing what's going on in the House of Representatives. Doesn't mean that he'll be more influential by taking the stronger stands, or that he was less influential by appearing to let Congress work its way. I mean, I think both characters of the president were probably overstated. I think he was very engaged in putting these proposals together. Maybe not enough, but it's not to say that he wasn't there. He'll be there now, but a lot of it will be more rhetorical than substance.
Yeah, I think also you may see Obama actually joining forces with congressional Republicans on the question of earmarks, because the White House doesn't like it when it sends over a budget to Congress and these lawmakers think up their own projects to use that money for instead of things that the White House recommended. So Obama is totally behind this ban on earmarks. And it's something that he could make common cause with Republicans on. The other part is deficit reduction. I think that Obama could take a much more forthright stance than any of the Democrats in Congress would be willing to take. And at least his image would be that I'm trying to get this thing done, I'm just not getting enough cooperation from Congress. He's got his own reelection to worry about, and that may be a factor in that too.
Thanks. Again, there will be a reception right outside immediately following the panel. In the meantime, please join me in